All right. Get ready to dive deep into mass communication. We've got a ton to unpack today. You send over some really interesting stuff from McQuail's mass communication theory, excerpts, visuals, even a peek at the preface. Seems like you're interested in the big picture of media and society, power dynamics, the works.
And you're right to start with McQuail. He jumps right into the thick of it. What even is mass communication? It's more complicated than you might think.
Oh, tell me about it. On page 42, he practically says, good luck finding a definition everyone agrees on.
Yeah, he even says it's more of an ideal, something we aim for, but rarely see in its pure form. Like everyone has their own idea of perfect weather.
Okay, so before we go full on academic, I'm curious, when you hear mass communication, what pops into your head first?
I think a lot of people picture like faceless crowds being controlled by powerful media. But as we dig into McQuail, you'll see it's way more nuanced.
Speaking of nuance, on page 102, he lays out four models of mass communication: transmission, ritual expressive, publicity, and reception.
Each one looks at how we experience media differently. So transmission is all about efficiency, getting info from point A to B, like a news alert. But then you have ritual expressive, which is about shared cultural experiences, that feeling of watching a big game with friends, that shared energy.
And then there's publicity, which is all about grabbing your attention. Think flashy ads everywhere.
Right. And finally, the reception model reminds us that the audience, you play a huge role in how you interpret these media messages.
It's not just a one-way street.
Exactly. Yeah. The same news story can be read completely differently depending on your background, your beliefs, even your mood.
Which brings us to the power dynamics. Page 132, McQuail gets into the classic Marxist view: media is controlled by the elite, serves their interests.
Important to separate that original view from what we call the neo-Marxist perspective, though.
Right. Subtle differences.
Exactly. Neo-Marxists are more interested in how media shapes our worldview, reinforces power structures. They use terms like hegemony, where dominant ideas become so normal they seem natural.
We don't even question them.
Right. Or false consciousness, where we accept ideas that might actually work against us.
Okay, big words, but how does that play out in real life?
Think product placement in movies. Seamlessly making that brand of phone look cool, even if it's not the best. That's ideological influence.
So it's not about avoiding media, but being a more critical, aware consumer.
Exactly.
Now, page 152, McQuail tackles technology, double-edged sword, right? It connects us, but also creates new ways to control and manipulate.
And this links directly to what you pointed out in the table of contents globalization, that sense of constant surveillance with new media.
It's like that feeling when you realize how much Facebook, Google, all of them know about you.
Yeah, a bit creepy. McQuail even calls it videotopia versus anti-utopia. Technology can liberate or oppress, depending on who's using it and how.
So big question for everyone listening: how do you deal with this constant push and pull between technology's good and bad sides?
It's about awareness,
Hmm.
being mindful of how you use technology, being critical of the information you come across online.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears a bit of the cultural side of mass communication. On page 157, there's this section, Communication of Masses and Culture. And it signals a move away from simply looking at media's effects towards how media shapes meaning itself.
Crucial difference. It's not just if violent video games make people more aggressive, but how all media influences our worldview, our values, even our identities.
And how different groups see popular culture. On page 168, McQuail talks about the Birmingham School, who were more optimistic about pop culture, compared to Frankfurt School, who saw mass media as a tool for manipulation.
The Birmingham School loved how people found meaning in pop music, TV things the Frankfurt School might have called shallow or harmful. They saw how people used pop culture to express themselves, build communities, even challenge the status quo.
So it's not about good or bad, but how we interact with it. What about you? What pop culture speaks to you? How do you think it's shaping your worldview?
It's a really interesting question, and it gets to the heart of what makes mass communication so multi-layered. It's not enough to just analyze the message. You've got to think about the whole cultural context, where it's coming from, who's consuming it, how they're interpreting it.
Totally. And on that note, McQuail spends a good chunk of the book talking about how we define the mass itself. On page 76, he even says the word itself is kind of loaded, often has a negative connotation.
Yeah, it can be a loaded term. You hear mass, you think faceless crowds, blind conformity, no individuality. It was a big fear in the early days of this kind of theory. People worried about mass manipulation propaganda.
So how does this idea of the mass connect to like the average person today experiencing media?
Well, check out this visual on page 78. Bloomer lays out 4 types of social groupings. The group, the crowd, the public, and the mass. Each one with different levels of organization, shared purpose.
I'm looking at it now.
Right. So think about it in terms of your own life. You've got your close friends, your group. Then there's the crowd at a concert. You're all there for the music, but you might not know each other. Then you've got the online public debating on Twitter or whatever. Different levels of connection, influence.
So where does the mass fit in?
The mass is the most scattered, disconnected group. And on page 82, Bauman actually argues that mass media isn't the cause of mass culture, more like a tool that amplifies what's already happening because of society itself.
So it's not creating the mass, it's just like giving it a louder voice.
Exactly. He points to things like industrialization, urbanization, the way traditional communities were breaking down. Media just gave those trends a platform.
This reminds me of another big idea from McQuail: media's role in mediation. Not just transmitting messages, but shaping our whole understanding of the world. Page 116.
Huge point. He calls it mediatization. It goes way beyond simple cause and effect. Media gives us information, sure, but it also frames how we see things, what we value, even who we are.
So it's a filter on reality, not a clear window.
Exactly. On page 118, McQuail uses all these metaphors to get this across. Media is a window, a mirror, a filter, a guide, a platform, a barrier. Each one showing a different side of how media shapes our view.
Makes me realize how much we just accept as normal in terms of how media influences us.
For sure. And that takes us to the really interesting part, analyzing the content itself. McQuail gets into how we break down media texts. Page 365, he defines a text as any media product with meaning news, movies, songs, even social media posts.
And you sent in some of your own notes about analyzing those texts. Lines up perfectly with what McQuail's saying on page 366.
Yep. Building on his point that we can't just passively consume media, we've got to analyze its form, its structure, the meaning underneath.
Become like media detectives.
Exactly. And this is important because, like he says on page 367, this kind of analysis can reveal hidden biases, ideologies, power dynamics. We can start to see how media might be shaping us in ways we don't even realize.
Okay, now I'm looking at my Netflix queue a little differently. But how do we even start breaking these texts down?
One way is genre analysis. McQuail talks about this, starting on page 403. We categorize media all the time. Horror, rom-com, hip-hop.
Right, genres give us an idea of what to expect.
Exactly. They're a framework. Knowing the genre helps you understand, decode the message.
So horror movies have different rules than rom-coms, even though they're both films.
Right. It's like shorthand for creators and audiences. And they change over time, too, reflecting bigger cultural shifts.
Like how reality TV went from non-existent to like its own universe of subgenres.
Exactly. Now, to get even deeper into the meaning, McQuail talks about semiotics on page 375.
Semiotics? That sounds kind of academic. What's that?
Basically, it's studying signs and symbols, how they make meaning. Remember that image you sent on page 376 about the sign?
Yes. It showed how a sign has the signifier, the actual word or image, and the signified, which is the meaning it represents. Like the word tree, that's the signifier, but the picture of a tree that pops into your head, that's what it signifies.
Exactly. And those meanings can be denotative, like the dictionary definition, or connotative, which is more about cultural understanding and emotion.
So rose denotes a flower, but it connotes romance or passion, maybe even danger, depending on how it's used.
Exactly. Getting those layers of meaning helps us decode how media messages are put together and what they're really doing to us.
It's like there's this hidden language inside the media we consume.
In a way, yeah. And speaking of language, McQuail also gets into narrative theory on page 368, how stories shape our worldview.
Story time. Everyone loves a good story.
It's more than just entertainment. It's how we make sense of the world, how we organize our experiences and find meaning in them. McQuail even says that news, as objective as it tries to be, still uses narrative to hook the audience.
So you're telling me the news is telling me a story, not just giving me the facts.
Exactly. There's always an angle, a way of presenting the events to make it compelling. Think about how different news channels can report on the same thing with completely different spins.
But that makes sense. It's like each news outlet has its own storytelling style. And that changes how we understand the information.
Exactly. And speaking of shaping interpretations, let's address the elephant in the room: gender. McQuail spends a lot of time on this, starting on page 168, media and sexes.
It's a huge topic, especially now that we're more aware of how representation in media can either reinforce or challenge what's considered normal.
For sure. We have to ask the critical questions. How are men and women being shown? What's the power dynamic? Is this contributing to stereotypes?
This isn't even new. Feminist scholars have been calling out things like underrepresentation, stereotyping, the objectification of women for decades.
Exactly. They showed how media can be harmful to women, pushing unrealistic beauty standards, reinforcing harmful roles.
Like the male gaze, the idea that so much media is from a man's perspective, women are just there to be looked at.
The male gaze is a key concept. We have to be aware of it. Who's making this media? Whose point of view are we seeing? Who's it for?
And how has this all changed or not since McQuail's book came out?
That's the big question. We've made some progress. There's more diversity, more complex female characters, but we've got a ways to go.
It seems like every woman in an action movie still has to be impossibly gorgeous and wear a skin-tight outfit.
True. We still see a ton of stereotypes about beauty, about what roles men and women should fill. It's a work in progress.
So we need to pay attention to these dynamics as we consume media. Ask ourselves, how are men being shown? Women, what messages are they sending about power, about sex, about what's normal?
Absolutely. That critical awareness is how we challenge these norms and demand better representation.
We've got to be active participants, not just letting it wash over us.
It's a two-way street, right? Like, we're shaped by the media we take in, but we also have a say in what gets made, what messages are out there, just by what we choose to consume.
It's about being an active participant, choosing what you watch, what you listen to, what you read. And that reminds me of one of McQuail's big points. There's no single theory that explains everything about mass communication. It's more about asking the right questions.
Exactly. That's what makes it so interesting. You can look at media through so many lenses. Feminist, Marxist, cultural, technological. Each one will show you something different, some new layer.
It's like having a whole toolkit.
Exactly. And that's where your own critical thinking is key. McQuail talks about this a lot. You can't just passively take in whatever's thrown at you. Be curious, question things. Don't just accept everything at face value.
So it's not enough to just watch TV or scroll through social media. We've got to engage with those messages. What are they really saying? What's the goal here?
Right. Think about who's sending the message, what they want, any biases they might have. Are they trying to influence you, and how? Asking those questions helps you be a smarter consumer, which is so important now because we're just drowning in information.
And it's only going to get more intense, right?
Yeah.
More information, more platforms,
That-
more everything. Media literacy is essential.
Totally. McQuail would say it's not even a bonus anymore, it's a requirement. You got to understand how media works, how it affects you, so you can be in control.
And that about wraps up this deep dive. We just scratched the surface of mass communication theory, but hopefully this gives you a good starting point.
It's a starting point, definitely.
Yeah.
Keep those questions coming, stay curious, and don't be afraid to challenge the media you're consuming.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Until next time, keep those brains engaged.